Thank you. Welcome to Washington. I'm glad you're all here. Thank you for inviting me to do this. And we've been wanting to put this together for a couple of years. I'm grateful that you're here at this really unique moment in human history and in the history of the world, because we're living through a moment of incredible change, transformative change. You know, we built a lot of what we knew as the world I grew up in the era after the Cold War, but the world is now rapidly changing. It's both rapidly changing geopolitically, where we have a return to what I think is the historic normal of great power competition between powerful nation states who have interests sometimes that are at odds with one another. But we're also living in a moment of profound, technological and social advance that I think is straining a lot of the institutions, both here domestically in our country, potentially in yours as well, but around the world that have dealt with the world. In essence, we built institutions and policies and viewpoints based on the 20th century, and what the 20th century looked like. And then we briefly lived in a world where counterterrorism after 9/11 was sort of the primary focus of American foreign policy. But we have now transitioned to something that frankly is new to someone like me who grew up in the 80s and has only been here since 2010, but is not new when you look at the course of human history. And that is that nation states compete against each other and sometimes have different goals which put them at odds. And the question is, how do we manage all that in a way that protects not just the values that we share, but the national interest of our respective countries, and at the same time avoid war and open conflict, which are always difficult and painful and tragic. And that's really what policymakers around the world are straining with. Part of that dynamic is the recognition, and this has always been true, but today more than ever before, that competition between nation states, national security, is not simply about military means. The industrial capacity of a nation, what it can make for itself, where it gets the things it relies on for its daily life, not just its defense, is national security. Technology is national security. Investment and how investments are used is national security. Energy will always be and has always been national security. And alliances are more critical than ever. Few countries, including this one, have the ability by itself to provide all of its needs. And so it needs partners, and it needs allies, and it needs strong alliances that cooperate, not simply in military exercises, but on how it approaches protecting intellectual property, on how it approaches protecting valuable technology and technological advances, how it provides for itself industrially, both for the needs of its economy and its people, but also for its military capabilities. And these alliances have become more critical than ever in the fact that today the world is being challenged on multiple fronts. In the Indo-Pacific region, China, and I say China, I say the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping in particular, are fully confident that they are destined to be the world's greatest power, and that will be his legacy, that the US and the broader West is in decline, irreversible decline, that at some point this is going to lead to hostility on the economic realm and potentially at the military realm, but in the end it will prevail. And they're not necessarily willing to make concessions, but they are certainly willing, they probably desire to avoid conflict in the interim, in the short to the extent possible, because they think that would set them back in what they believe is their inevitable rise. And the West and democratic nations and our allies in the United States in particular needs to respond, needs to recognize it for what it is. Now, one of the things they're also convinced of is that the US and the world will never accept a powerful China. They're going to have to take it. I don't think anyone here has been more forceful or early in warning about this competition than I have been, and yet I would acknowledge that China is going to be a rich and powerful country for the rest of my lifetime. And so much of what we will have to do over the next remaining decades of the century is decide, how do we reach a world in which there's a balance and an equilibrium between our values, our allies, our interests, and whatever China decides to do as part of their own rise. We can't dictate the course that China takes. Xi Jinping won't always be the head of that country, and I don't know what could develop and happen over time. But in the interim, we know what we're dealing with, and so the question is, how do we protect our interests? How do we prevent the result of the zero-sum game, as he views it, which is they win and we lose, without living in a world where not only they become the dominant nation, but one that's able to hold hostage and or leverage the rest of the world and mold it to the shape they want, to their benefit. Russia is led by a man who, frankly, views himself as having restored Russia to global prominence. And some days it's hard to, I'm not a psychologist, but I think Putin in very many ways views himself as Russia and Russia as him, and is clearly a junior partner at this point in this effort to reorient the world into an order that is more favorable to their points of view and less favorable to the ones that we share. North Korea is led by someone who has to figure out how to remain a dictator for 50 or 60 more years. And he's decided that his insurance policy is not just nuclear weapons, but the ability to strike anyone who would try to remove him. And obviously there's always real risk there because we know we have very little insight into the decision-making process. And I always think that dealing with the son and grandson of a dictator who has never been told no and has executed everyone who has in the past is always a delicate balance that we'll have to figure out and how to minimize. And then Iran is led by clerics. It's interesting because I don't think the culture, their Persian culture is an ancient culture, it's a rich culture, and its leadership does not reflect it. They want to create a Middle Eastern order centered on Tehran in which they are the regional power that holds sway, and they are trying to build this arc of influence. And they do so not just by supporting regimes like Assad, but ultimately by supporting more terrorist groups than any other nation on the planet. And these are not isolated. They are increasingly acting in concert. So where is Putin getting the weaponry to make up for the losses that they've suffered? From North Korea, from Iran. They're getting as much assistance from China as China can get away with without being caught. So, and publicly revealed, and they continue to buy their oil, which has kept afloat their energy resources. So in that context, we have to understand where is the battlefield. The battlefield is not simply who has more aircraft carriers or more fighter jets. The battlefield is who has access to natural resources, who has access to rare earth minerals, who has access to oil and natural gas. Even as some continue to envision a world in which we are depending entirely on renewables, that world is not one any of us will live to see. We will continue to live in a world where a substantial percentage of the humans on this planet will need to live in economies and in societies that are powered by traditional sources of energy, as clean as we may endeavor to make them. Who controls those resources? And that's a fact that we're going to have to think about. I talk about rare earth minerals because they're not actually that rare. They are available. Lithium you can mine in multiple places, but the world depends heavily on China for it because they subsidize the companies that control it, and they set the global price, and the global price is always below the price, the cost point for a private entity. So if you want to get into mining and exploiting and developing a lithium mine or other rare earth mineral mine, you can't, because whatever it costs you to do that, the Chinese will subsidize their companies to set the price point below it, and now you can't compete, and then they control it. I think about my own country here in the United States, where 88% of the active ingredients in our medicines are manufactured in China, not because they know how to do it and no one else does, but again, because the market says it's more efficient to do it that way. And then even as we talk about those sort of legacies, there are also new industries that are emerging. Precision medicine, the ability to cure disease at the genetic level, not by giving you a pill, but by giving you a medicine specifically designed for the cancer you have for someone with your genetic makeup, is the future of medicine. And they're investing very heavily in this. And they can compel the genetic information of over 1.5 billion people, and they can steal the genetic information of billions more, and have. And they are making real investments. Whoever controls precision medicine will frankly control pharmaceuticals in the world for the rest of the century. I can go on and on. Telecommunications. A lot of people don't think about it, telecommunications. But when you invite Huawei, which is cheaper than Nokia and some of these others, into your country, you are basically embedding into your country a system of communication that the Chinese can utilize at any point to collect data and information. Who needs spies? Who needs satellites when you are the phone company for the country and can control it and or deny it in a time of conflict? Suddenly the Huawei routers don't work. And in a time of conflict. Think about the leverage that provides. I could be here for 20, 30 minutes just going through industry after industry. But we don't traditionally view these as in the realm of national security, but they are. They're critical to national security. They always have been, but more so than ever before. And then I talk about industrial capacity. If my country and others in the West have made a mistake over the last 20 or 30 years, is deindustrialization for two reasons. The first is it wiped out good-paying jobs, which left society vulnerable to a lot of discontent, and a lot of it is boiled over into our politics. But the other is, and COVID reminded us of it, if you can't make things for yourself, and your allies who are close by can't make it either, you are now reliant on supply chains far away who may be disrupted. They may be disrupted because they're going through an epidemic, or in the future they may be disrupted because it's being used against you in a time of conflict. So it's not hard to envision a moment where you depend, I'm just using this as a scenario, the United States and its allies and China have a showdown over Taiwan or the Philippines or somewhere else. And the Chinese decide, well, what we're going to do is we're going to deny you access to these things that you depend for. And you can just imagine the impact that that would have on that society and on that country. Not just to provide for itself militarily, but to keep its people together, to not create chaos. So I think that these are all things that we need to begin to think about as we think about national security. National security today, because of the nature of the world, goes well beyond military capabilities. And in fact, the military capabilities needed to discourage war, which is really the ultimate goal of military capability, is to convince a potential adversary not to go to war, because if they do, they will lose. In the history of the world, few people go to start a war they think they're going to lose. They generally start wars because they think they're going to win. And if they have doubt about it, they usually avoid entering war. Miscalculation happens. There are leaders that convince themselves of things that aren't true and end up finding themselves in a conflict. But generally, that level of deterrence works. And the lack of deterrence is generally an invitation for adventurism. So you want to have a military capability that deters war and prevents it. But to have that capability, you have to have technological capabilities, industrial capability, and the will to do it, and the focus to do it. So that's a lot to work on, and it's one that we'll have to work on together. In the end, I think it's always important for us to remind ourselves that freedom, liberty, democracy, the values we share, these things are important. They've been life-changing, but they are not natural. And I don't mean that they're bad. In the history of the world, 5,600 years of recorded history, democracy's 260, 270 years old, maybe, at most. Almost everyone that's ever lived in the history of the world did not live in democracy. They lived in a place, whether it's a society, a tribal society, or a nation state, where the person who was in charge is not the person you put there, you voted for, you supported. It's the person who won the last war. It's the person who can kill the most people who are against them. And that's been the rule for most of human history. Democracy is a young concept. And liberty and freedom is a young concept. The idea that people have rights as individuals, not the rights that your leaders allow you to have, is also very young and very new. And that's why I say it's unnatural. That is, human beings do not automatically become democratic, do not automatically support other people's liberties and freedoms. You have to have a commitment to it, and then you have to have the infrastructure and the institutions and the laws to set that up and to protect you from yourself. Because at the end of the day, that's the one thing we do have to understand about human nature, is that there is no human being on this planet so noble, so smart, such a good person, that we should ever entrust them with absolute power, because human beings with absolute power will always, even the best among us, will always end up making mistakes. So, or worse. So I think it's important, as we think about all this, we understand that what's at stake here is not just bragging rights about which country is the most powerful or which countries are the most powerful. What's at stake here, literally, is the freedom and democracy now and for the foreseeable future. Because the world order that's being promoted by China and Russia and Iran and places like North Korea is not one that promises to promote our concepts of democracy and liberty. On the contrary, they use the same terms, but their definition of human rights, their definition of liberty, their definition of democracy, to the extent that that exists in their lexicon, is very different than ours. Very different than ours. And that's the promise that they make. They go to countries and they say, and other developing nations, and they say, if you align with us, Not only are we going to be the most powerful country and we're going to help you and we're going to invest in building all kinds of things in your country for you, but we're not going to be here lecturing you. We're not going to be here telling you about your human rights record, or we're not going to be here lecturing you about your democracy. And look, I think there's a room for pragmatism. In a time like this is a time in which we need to have allies and friends. And I think we need to take that into account as we approach other countries and how we deal with our internal. And every society and culture is at a different state in terms of how prepared they are and how close they are to that sort of concept that we would define as Western democracy and so forth. That said, I do think it's in the benefit and in the interest of many of these countries to be pluralistic, because ultimately the lack of that in most societies leads to internal conflict. And I'll close with this. There is one that autocratic dictators have some advantages. So for example, if China decides they want to do something, they don't have to have a town hall meeting, they don't have to have a vote, they just go and they do it. And CPC has an advantage, much more efficient. Democracy is not efficient. If you spent, 24, 48 hours, some of you here in Washington, there's constant reminders of how inefficient it is. Because people have opinions and they like to give their opinions and they argue about it and then they go on TV and call each other names about it. So it's very messy. Democracy is very messy. But the reason why I still think it's better, far better, is the following. In autocracies, no one tells the people in charge that they're wrong. Okay, if you work in that government and you know that the leader's making a mistake, you don't say that to the leader. A, because it's not rewarded. Right? That no one promotes you. Oh, thank you for telling me I was wrong. You saved me from a mistake, I'm going to promote you. You're not rewarded for telling them they're wrong. And second, they don't produce information that conflicts. Because if you're trying to get promoted, let's say you're an analyst in one of these governments, the leaders in an autocracy are not going to read a report that tells them how bad things are going. They only want to read reports to tell them how good things are going. And so you know that if you want your stuff to be written, you need to write what the person wants to hear. Now, sometimes it is going well, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes that virus that's spreading through your country is not just the flu. It's a pandemic. But who wants to admit that? I would imagine it's like the people in Chernobyl. Nobody wanted to pick up the phone and call Moscow and say, yeah, the reactor melted down over here, because you're not going to get a medal or promoted for that. So they sort of denied they had a problem until they couldn't. This happens all the time. Think of, does Putin really, if Putin knew that the war would take the direction it's now taken, would he have invaded? I doubt it. I'm confident that he was told, the Ukrainians love you, Mr. President. They want you to invade. They will greet you as a liberator. And Zelensky's going to jump on a plane and take off as soon as you cross that border. That's what he was told. That's what he wanted to hear. So he started a war. And now the outcome, we see what it has been. So I think these are important disadvantages that system has. And we, on the other hand, have way too many people that tell you don't know what you're talking about and that you're wrong. But what it does is this, not everybody here shares my views on what America's role in the world should be, or even our domestic politics. Not even everyone in my party does. But here's the thing we're missing. When people challenge, even if everyone has known that, let's say I have a position and it's been pretty consistent, been a consensus position in our politics for 20 years, and then someone new comes in and challenges it in your own party. And at that point, some people think that's a bad thing. That's a source of division. That's a source of conflict. But here's what it causes you to do. It forces you to go back, analyze your position, and defend it, and justify it. You don't have to do that if everyone is agreeing. But when you are challenged, what it causes you to do, it challenges your assumptions, it challenges what you've made decisions on and the assumptions you've used to make decisions in the past, and you reach one of two conclusions. I need to adjust my policy, or I'm more convinced than ever that I'm right. But the fact that it was challenged causes you to go back and re-engage with it. You don't have to do that in autocracies. And ultimately, it leads to disaster. The last great disadvantage of autocracy is the number one thing they care about is power and control. So that is why I don't care how rich you are in China. You could be the richest man in China. In fact, the richest man in China experienced this. If you get too powerful, if you start having things like opinions, you will be silenced. You will be erased. You will be reminded that in the end, we don't have any Bill Gates here. We don't have any Elon Musks in China. We don't have any individuals who make so much money that they have a right to tell people what they think. And what that does ultimately is it does destroy creativity and innovation. Because in the end, you were seeing it already now, do you really want to invest the future of your company, no matter how big their market is, in a place that at any time can accuse you of corruption and storm your building and put you in jail and take everything away and hand it over to somebody else? You can ask the oligarchs, how many oligarchs have filled Putin's jails? One of them ended up dying in a plane accident after trying to overthrow, if you believe it was a plane accident, right? After challenging him. And in China, we've seen example after example. So autocracy doesn't tolerate. It always puts power and control over prosperity and good decisions. And so I think that's a disadvantage. Our system's better than theirs. Our values are better than theirs. They're harder. They're more unnatural. You have to work in each generation to preserve it, primarily from those who challenge it. So that's the challenge we face in the world today. And so I'm always grateful to be able to speak to people from all over the world in so many different countries who share these values and who also want to understand what we need to do moving forward. But it will take a concerted international strategy and alliance to ensure that our children and grandchildren live in a world not just as free as it is today, but freer, not just as prosperous as today, but more prosperous, and one where our way of life, the way of life we work so hard to establish and create, not just here, but in every continent in the world, can endure for a generation more. And I'm always grateful for the chance to talk about it. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.